right, jazz saxophonists, welcome back to part 3 of our 2020 Jazz Educators of Iowa Honor Jazz Combo Day Saxophone Masterclass. In part 3, what we're going to do today is we're going to take everything that we learned in parts 1 and part 2, and we're going to put it together and hopefully come up with a fun and interactive way to practice all of our scales and arpeggios, so that way when we get up to take a solo, we are ready to go and are comfortable with what we are doing. So, as we begin, one of the things that you're going to want to know before you start playing it and practicing interactively is you're going to want to know the form of the tune that is that you're playing. There are many different forms out there, ranging from maybe a form as short as 8 bars all the way up to maybe even 32 bars. So it's really important to know the form that you're playing, so that way you know when to start your solo and when to end it, and you don't, you can avoid those embarrassing times where you maybe step on somebody else's solo or take too long with a solo and no one else knows what to do. So for our example today, we're going to be using a 12-bar blues form, and so that means every 12 measures or every 12 bars is a new chorus. You may end up taking one chorus or 2 choruses or however many you get assigned, but at least by knowing the form, you're going to kind of have an idea of how long you should be soloing the form. So that's really important to know. So today's example, 12-bar blues. In part 2, we kind of talked a little bit about what the chord symbols meant, like at the top of what you'd see at the top of your page. We didn't really dive too far into that, because we're going to do that here in part 3. So on the board, I have what you may see on your music at the top above each measure, different types of chords related to major, dominant 7th, and minor 7th. So hopefully those letters and numbers that you see now, they're going to start to make a little bit more sense as we kind of put this all together. So for major quality chords, there's a few different ways that I've seen it written. The first and probably most common way is a letter. In this case, I'm going to use G as my example, a G triangle 7. So that means the chord that's being played is a G major 7th chord. So we know that we can improvise using our G major scale, and that we're going to be utilizing our G major 7th chord tones, the root, 3rd, 5th, and 7th from our major scale. A couple other ways that I've seen it written, it would be a G, M, A, J, 7, and usually it's going to be with a capital M, for the major we think capitals, or G, capital M, and then an A, 7, G, Ma, 7. All those mean, so all 3 of those mean G major 7th chord to play. For dominant 7th, there's lots of ways that we can alter chords and do some different things, but for right now, the most common way you're going to see it written is G, and then followed directly by the number 7. You will not see with the dominant 7th chord any sort of like triangle or minus sign or anything there. It's just the letter followed by the number. So for dominant today, it's really easy. It'd be just G, 7. So that means we can use our Mixolydian scale to improvise with, and then the chord tones would be 1, 3, 5, and then that lowered 7. For minor 7th chords, the most common is probably a G with a minus sign followed by a 7. The minus sign being obviously minor. The other 2 ways that I have there are G, M, I, N, and notice for minor it's a small m. So that's one way to distinguish between major with capital and small for minor. Or a G, M, I, 7. So all 3 of those would mean that you're going to be playing over a minor quality chord, and so in this case we could use our Dorian scale, which if we think back to our majors, it's the lower, has a lower 3rd and lower 7th, and so then the chord tones that would sound good over that would be 1, flat 3, 5, flat 7, as it would relate to the major 7. So that's just a quick way to read those. If you have any questions, be sure to ask your teacher, because like I said, sometimes they might look a little funny or have some alterations, but this is the most boiled down and simplified way to look at those. So with that being said, in your handout or in your handouts, you should have a sheet that has some chord changes written on it. And on the top half of that sheet, I have it transposed out, concert B-flat blues for alto and bari sax. And on the bottom, I have it transposed out for tenor saxophone, so that way you could follow along and write on there as needed. I also put it up here on the board, and to save space, what I did was alto and baris are written in black, and tenor sax are written, chord changes are written in red. So before we start soloing and doing some playing, we need to kind of first do our homework and study these these chord changes a little bit so we understand what to play, when to play, how to play. So, let's just take a quick look into these chord changes and just discuss them so that way we understand what they are before we go on and use them playing. So, first measure. You can see that for alto sax we have a G dominant 7th. For tenor sax we have a C dominant 7th. So we can utilize our Mixolydian scale, and then our chord tones we would have the 1, 3, 5, and lower 7th. In measure 2, still a dominant quality chord. For alto and bari it's a C dominant 7th, and for tenor sax it's an F dominant 7th. And then in measure 3 we have, it goes back to G dominant 7th for alto and bari, and C dominant 7th for tenor sax. You'll notice in measure 4 there's nothing written there. When you see that, that means to just keep playing the same chord change in the measure before it, so that this chord change is the exact same as the one there. As we go into measure 5, the second line of our chord changes, for alto and bari we have C dominant 7th, and for tenor sax we have an F dominant 7th, and we already have that up in measure 2, so nothing new there. Measure 6 is going to be the same as measure 5, so we have 2 measures of the same chord. When we get to measure 7, once again we have G dominant 7th for alto bari, C dominant 7th for tenor sax, and that's good for measures 7 and 8, so those 2 measures for those 2 changes. Again, nothing new from the first 4 measures. So the first 8 measures we've only had 2 different chords to really worry about. But now when we get to measure 9, the last phrase of our blues form, you can see here we have a minor quality chord. So for alto and bari, we have an A minor 7. So that means we'll be utilizing our Dorian scale there. Remember that has a flat 3rd and flat 7 when we compare it to our major scale. And for tenor sax, we'd be using our D Dorian scale. And so for chord tones, for our chord arpeggios, we'd be using 1, flat 3, 5, and flat 7. When we get to measure 10, we have a D dominant 7th chord for alto and bari, and a G dominant 7th chord for tenor sax, and that one's new. Back to our G dominant 7th and C dominant 7th in measure 11, and then the same thing we had in measure 10, we have in measure 12. At that point, that's the end of the chorus, so either you're done with your solo, or if you're taking 2 courses, you would just play it over again and you repeat that entire form for your solo. So that's why it's really important to know the length of your solo, so you have a less likelihood of getting lost. So on your worksheet or on the chord change that I provided for you, you'll notice that underneath the form, I wrote in some spots for you to write out your G Mixolydian scales, or your C Mixolydian scales, or your Dorian scales. So you can utilize that as a worksheet if you'd like to pencil some of that out. You could just briefly draw out the scale and maybe draw out the chord outline in 1, 3, 5, 7. So that way you can utilize that in your practice. If you're practicing along or going through your scales and your chords each day as part of your practice routine, hopefully you can skip that step, because the more that you can think this in your head, while it may take you a little bit longer initially, you're probably going to have an easier chance of remembering it and memorizing some of this as you go forward in the future. So hopefully each time you go through this process, the less and less paper and pencil work that you need to do. But it's provided there in case you want to write all of that out. So now it's time to kind of start putting this together. So before that I would turn on any sort of rhythm section background or anything else, I want to go through and just like we did on the worksheet, let's go through and just be able to simply play each of those scales and each of those chords, so that way we know we've at least got it underneath our fingers. So for me using alto, I'm going to start with our G Mixolydian, or our concert B flat Mixolydian scale, and then we'll play the dominant 7, G dominant 7th chord along with that. So I would make sure that I'm articulating in that jazz style that we talked about in parts 1 and part 2. So it sounds like this. So something for you to practice, make sure you got it underneath your fingers. I'll go on to the next one. On our worksheet here we have our C Mixolydian. So I'll play my C Mixolydian scale and then my C dominant 7th chord. Okay, octaves, so that way you get comfortable with the technique on different ranges of the instrument. The next one we ran across for altos are A Dorian or D Dorian for tenor sax. So now we'll play that Dorian scale and then the minor chord that accompanies that. So here it is. And then the last one are for alto, are D mixed leading or G mixed leading for tenor sax. Play the scale and then the dominant seventh chord right after that. So until you're comfortable with that step right there, just kind of going through and isolating and playing each one of those scales and chords individually, until we're comfortable that we probably don't want to play with any sort of background, just so that way we can make sure we don't get lost with it, or we can keep up with it. So now we're getting into the fun part. Now it's time to practice and actually put this to use. And what's great about our point in history right now is there's lots of different ways that we can practice interactively. And so some ways that I encourage my students to practice interactively, it's amazing what you can find on YouTube. So sometimes if you have nothing else, you can just go on a quick search of YouTube, maybe type in concert B-flat blues background track. Or if you know of a tune, maybe like Tenor Madness is in the key of a B-flat blues chart, you could type that in and see what comes up. And I know that there are some backing tracks out there. So you could utilize that to play along with. The other cool thing about YouTube is if you go into the settings, you can actually speed it up or slow it down. So if you're not 100% or you don't have it quite up to tempo yet, you could always slow it down and work it up. And it's just more fun to play along with the background and to hear the bass and the ride cymbal and the piano accompaniment rather than just playing by yourself with a metronome. A second program that you can use, and this is the one that I would highly recommend you get a hold of if possible, there's an app called iReal Pro. And what you can do is you can download that on any mobile device. There is a cost with it. I believe it's in the $12 to $15 range. But if you're able to pay money for your apps, your parents allow you to do that, it's well worth the money, because once you download it, you can actually load immediately over 1,000 different chord changes to different jazz songs. The jazz songs won't be notated in there, but the chord changes are in there. You can even create your own. So I oftentimes for my students will create different background tracks and email the sound file to them so they can practice at home. So the other great thing about utilizing the app like that is you can speed it up and slow it down to whatever tempo you want. So maybe you're comfortable at 100 beats per minute and the song is we're supposed to play this up to 140. Well, you could start at 100 and work your way up, and you could practice, everywhere in between that. You could also transpose it. So you could take B-flat blues and transpose to any of the other 11 keys. So you could practice your blues in all 12 keys, and you're covering all the different scales that go along with that. So that iReal Pro app is really, really beneficial, a really cool resource for you to use. Some other things that may be available to you if you use Smart Music, there's some Smart Music improv applications out there within that program that you can utilize, or maybe your teacher has Band in a Box where they can create some rhythm section or backing tracks for you, or the old Jamie Abersol's, all of those. Those you might want to ask your teacher about, but the two that are easily you can get a hold of are YouTube backing tracks and the iReal Pro if you're willing to pay for it. So, with all that said, I'm going to use a recording of my iReal Pro track that I created for this B-flat blues. And what we're going to do is I'm going to take you kind of through, once I get my computer loaded up here, here we go, take you through a practice routine for scales, arpeggios, and all sorts of little patterns that we can utilize and how to practice it with it. So, first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to play the different scales, the Mixolydian scales and the Dorian scale that we have going on here. I'm going to utilize my offbeat tonguing, so my jazz articulations, and I'm also, if it's one measure, I'm going to play the scale ascending. If it's two measures, I'm going to play ascending in the first measure and descending in the second measure. So this is where having those commands and those scales is really going to come into play, because things are going to be moving rather quickly, and you've got to be able to, at sight, understand what scale needs to be played. So make sure that you do your homework ahead of time. So here we go. Here is our B-flat blues. We're playing through the scales. So if you're able to keep up with me on that, great job. I think I had about tempo 120-ish. If not, if you have that iReal Pro app like I was talking about earlier, you could slow it down to wherever it is that you need it to be at, so you could work it at a tempo that was appropriate for your technique level. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to outline the chords. So we're going to be playing the 1, 3, 5, and 7. So there's different ways of doing this. We could, maybe the easiest way at first is just to play it ascending in quarter notes. Once you're comfortable with that, we could do ascending maybe eighth notes, and you can maybe get creative with your jazz, your rhythms and your articulations, because with it only being 4 notes, you'll have a couple beats left. So that's where you can kind of start to improvise rhythmically with that. And then kind of the advanced version would be, can you play up and down in each measure? So I just got one chorus pre-recorded here. What I'll do is I'll kind of go through 3 different possibilities for you. So here we'd be playing with quarter notes ascending. So there, I just played quarter notes. You could go up one measure and down the next to practice some descending as well. So the second thing that I'm going to do here is now I'm going to vary the rhythm a little bit, just ascending. So I just kind of had fun making up my own rhythms to it and still trying to swing the articulations. And then the third way, I'm going to play up and down in each measure. Outlining the chords, ascending and descending in each measure. So the good part about this is you can tell, because I've been doing this for a couple of years now, I at least have good technical facility on my instrument. I'm putting things in the right spot, I'm articulating, and what that's going to allow me to do eventually when I go to solo is I don't have to worry about playing the right notes or playing the right rhythms or articulating a certain way. It starts to become second nature, and so that's the point of going through some of these practice methods. So the last thing on our outline here that I have written down are digital patterns. And what I mean by digital patterns, remember back in part 1 when we put the scale degrees to our scales, we can take those numbers and create little patterns. And that can cause us to learn or create all sorts of new little ideas or little musical motives that we can, come back and repeat or reference to. It can be really handy little musical ideas during our solo. So one of the easiest ones is that first one there that I have listed on our sheet is a 1, 1, 2, 1. Once again, you can be creative, maybe play it as 4 eighth notes to start, and then you could, kind of like we did with the arpeggio, we could change the rhythm. So if I did a 1, 1, 2, 1 over my G dominant 7th chord, I would use G, G, and then the second note of our G mixolydian scale is A, so there's G, G, A, and then return to 1 on G. And I could transpose that to all the different chord changes. So I could play it like, so on and so forth, and play it through all the different measures. I could do a 1, 2, 3, 1 pattern. Once I'm comfortable with that and I'm swinging, maybe I change the rhythm a little bit using just those same notes. So that way you're not just playing, it doesn't sound like a digital pattern, it actually sounds like a musical idea. One of the more popular bebop digital patterns that you'll see or hear out there is a 1, 2, 3, 5. So I would, over my G mix lid, I'd have G, A, B, and the fifth, we'd skip, C would be the fourth, so we're going to skip that and go to D, which is the fifth. So I could use. There I went 5, 3, 2, 1 on the end. And you can come up with any sorts of permutations in between. So that's the cool thing about digital patterns, is the opportunities there are endless for you to come up with really cool little solo ideas. So you could put that with your background track as you go through and just play those little ideas over each chord change as it comes up. And make sure when you're doing that, once again, do it with a jazz articulation using the offbeat tonguing, so that way you're also practicing good jazz style. So hopefully these 3 parts that we've done over the last couple, or these 3 sessions is helpful for you. Kind of some closing thoughts. Number 1, the most important thing that you can do is to learn all 12 of your major scales and be comfortable with those. Because as you know from part 1, we've built everything else off of that knowledge. So make sure you learn all 12 of your major scales and become comfortable with the scale degrees within those, so that way you can take different, like here, different little digital patterns and transpose them, or we can take our major scales and learn even other jazz scales, whether it's bebop scale, blues scale, whatever it is. We can take at least that foundational knowledge of our major scales and apply it to learn something new. My second thing I want to leave you with is make sure that you have a plan when you practice. So hopefully these last 3 sessions kind of give you an idea of how to go about interpreting a lead sheet and how to make the necessary changes to our major scales to come up with some jazz scales and chords to help us with that. Make sure that you always apply your offbeat tonguing anytime that you're practicing that, so you're improving your style. And if you're utilizing a technology, utilize that to practice at a tempo that allows you to be as close to perfect as possible. So you're always setting good habits for yourself and playing to the best of your ability. Lastly, utilize all of those technology resources you have out there these days to make your practicing more fun and more interactive and engaging. So, best of luck to all of you. It's been fun. So go ahead and get to practicing all those major scales, and I hope to hear you guys applying this in your jazz charts during jazz band season. Good luck.